Hi, this is Dan Benardot, and we're just continuing with our discussion on carbohydrates. So we'll pick it up on the next slide, which is this one, the physiological aspects of fiber. As we discussed earlier, there are two major types of fibers, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. And the soluble fiber consists of gums, mucilages, and pectins. You may be familiar with pectins because fruit pectins are very often used to make jams and jellies. Gums, of course, are the same thing that you chew on, which is why it's called gum. They have a very interesting characteristic in that they decrease gastric emptying time. That is, they tend to cause foods that you consume to leave the stomach a little bit faster. So it decreases the amount of time that the bolus of food that you eat leaves the stomach. Now, don't conceptualize this as you eat a big bolus, it goes in the stomach, and then it just all of a sudden dumps itself into the small intestine. Rather, gastric emptying time should be thought of as kind of a time-mediated effect. The speed with which it leaves the stomach and goes into the small intestine. One way to think of it is the faucet a trickle, or is it full bore? Is it a very high volume leaving per unit of time? So with gums and mucilages, it tends to make gastric emptying time a little bit less, so they leave the stomach a little sooner. It does increase mouth to cecum transit time. That is, it tends to, once it's in the small intestine, it tends to slow it down just a little bit. And it attaches itself. It has a binding effect on glucose and bile acids. Some of that's good because if you have too much glucose entering the bloodstream too quickly, then what happens is you can get too much insulin produced and make too much fat from the glucose, which is entered very quickly. So a small amount of binding on glucose is useful. And then because bile acid is about 50% cholesterol, it's also good to bind some of the bile acids so you don't absorb as much of the cholesterol. Remember, these are non-absorbable substances. So if anything gets bound to fiber, because the fiber is indigestible and therefore non-absorbable, it tends to clear it out of the system. Wheat bran, which is part of the indigestible polysaccharide or indigestible carbohydrate, has a slightly different effect. It increases gastric emptying time. That is, it tends to leave things that you've eaten into the stomach a little bit longer. So from the time you eat till the time it's all out of the stomach takes a little bit longer. It does decrease the amount of time that it goes from the mouth to the time it leaves your system. And that's just exactly the opposite effect of soluble fiber, right? So while this makes it move slower, insoluble fiber makes it move faster, and it decreases the total transit time. And it also decreases the pressure inside the gut, which makes it easier for your gut to move things through the intestine. Part of the reason for that is that one of the characteristics of insoluble fiber is that it has a really high water holding capacity. So it tends to swell up, and because of that swelling and the water which is in the stool, it makes things move through the system a little bit faster, and that decreases the chance for constipation. So let's move on to the next slide. There are some other physiological effects. Lignin, which is part of the insoluble fiber, it's a non-carbohydrate actually, but considered part of the insoluble fiber. Pectin, which is part of the soluble fiber, and then if you have a combination of these things, both soluble and insoluble, you tend to increase the amount of steroidal fats which are removed from the system. That's generally considered to be good for your health. You also increase the amount of fat that shows up in your fecal matter, and you may also bind a little bit of protein and move that so it becomes unabsorbable as well. All of this is generally considered, pretty good. That's a good thing because you're not absorbing some things which may potentially be damaging to the health. And then there are pectins, which are acidic polysaccharides, again, part of the soluble fiber mix. They tend to bind bivalent minerals. So some of these minerals like calcium, iron, magnesium, zinc, could be lost. They don't get absorbed. And you may also not absorb some other minor trace elements. That's also, on balance, it's a good thing because the binding effects of pectin with fats are more important than the binding effects that you may get from minerals, where you lose some of these minerals. So on balance, it's considered a good thing. Lignin, which again is a non-carbohydrate component of fiber, particularly insoluble fiber, tend to decrease the free radical activity in the digestive tract. Free radicals can damage cell nucleuses and give you an increased risk of cancer. So that's generally considered pretty good. And then other polysaccharides, which are free of lignin, may increase gas production and fatty acid production because bacteria feed off these polysaccharides and then they digest those things that you can't digest, and one of the byproducts is gas formation. Some of you, I'm sure, have experienced this. When you eat a lot of foods which are with a lot of fiber in it, you can feel a little bloated because the bacteria in your gut are having, quote, a heyday and getting a lot of nutrition from the things that you can't digest. The bacteria there can digest them. So what happens with carbohydrates that you can digest? Well, you break the carbohydrates down into their most simple components, which is primarily the disaccharides and then ultimately glucose. And glucose is the primary fuel for cells, so you get energy, carbon dioxide, and water as a byproduct, and it's a primary fuel for the production of ATP, which is where we get all of our metabolic energy. And glucose can be burned both anaerobically and aerobically, so it's a flex fuel. It can go either way, with oxygen or without oxygen, so it ends up being a very important fuel. Remember that the primary delivery system for this very important fuel is the consumption of carbohydrates. You can't easily get it from protein, and you can't get it at all from fat. So it becomes a really important source of energy. If you have too much glucose entering the cells too quickly, which can happen if you just eat simple sugars without fiber, for instance, then a proportion of that can be converted to fat. And the intermediary product of that is acetyl coenzyme A. So it goes to acetyl coenzyme A, and then you make fat out of it. And the fats that are produced are fatty acids, which eventually combine with glycerol to form the triglycerides, which are the primary storage form of fats in our bodies. We need to have at least 50, depending on your body size, 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per day to prevent ketosis, which occurs when you try to burn fats without the adequate presence of carbohydrate. So it's not good because ketosis or ketoacidosis can eventually be damaging to the kidneys. It's not a good thing to have. So the average U.S. daily intake is 200 to 300 grams. So most people get more than double what they need of the carbohydrate to prevent ketosis. But remember, it should still constitute somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 65% of total calories. The problem is that people don't know how to eat the carbohydrate correctly to avoid some of the fat manufacturing effects that it potentially can have. Another issue is dietary fiber. Ideally, you need 20 or 30 grams or more, and it looks like the U.S. average daily intake is half of what we need. So here, our carbohydrate intake is more than double of what we need to prevent ketosis, but of that, the carbohydrate we're consuming is too low in fiber, and that causes some very serious, potentially damaging digestive effects. It can make you hyperinsulinemic. You can get too much of the carbohydrate in the blood too quickly, so it might encourage the production of fats, which of course would not be good. We get carbohydrates from all of these things, not just grains or breads. I mean, obviously legumes are a good source of carbohydrate, seeds, pasta, fruits, vegetables, all sources of carbohydrate. Some of these, have more or less fiber, or different kinds of fiber. So fruits and vegetables are a little bit higher in the soluble fiber, whereas grains are a little bit higher in the insoluble fiber. And legumes have a good mix of both insoluble and soluble fiber. So legumes are a nice food to have. If you look at the energy stores in man, you can see that, we discussed this earlier, we really don't do a very good job of storing carbohydrates, which is why we have to figure out eating patterns for how to satisfy our carbohydrate requirements over the course of a typical day. That generally requires more frequent carbohydrate consumption and eating a little bit more often, having some small snacks between our major meals and so on, just to make sure that the carbohydrate tank never runs dry. Primarily, the two things that people would have to worry about would be to make sure that liver glycogen always has something in it so that blood sugar can be maintained, because liver glycogen is the source of carbohydrate that actually keeps blood sugar normal. So in a way, there are two carbohydrate systems to remember. One is, the liver has, depending on your body size, up to 400 calories of carbohydrate in it as glycogen. For a smaller person, maybe 300 calories here instead of 400. It supplies glucose to the blood, the brain, and the muscles. I mean, blood glucose is the primary fuel for the brain, but blood glucose is also fuel for working muscles. When glucose flow to the brain gets low, you get mental fatigue, and that results in muscular fatigue, even if your muscles are full of energy. So it's very important to make sure that liver glycogen never tanks, so that you always have some there. Muscle is broken down to supply alanine for the conversion of glucose to keep blood sugar normal if liver glycogen is empty. But now you've lowered muscle in order to satisfy the liver storage of glycogen, and that's generally considered counterproductive. Muscle glycogen is maybe about 2,000 calories max, but remember, we use glycogen specific to the muscles that we're using, so that 2,000 calories is a little bit misleading in terms of how long you've got before you run out of muscle glycogen. There are ways to improve the storage of carbohydrate as glycogen in muscles. I mean, one way is just increase the amount of carbohydrate you consume every day. The higher your intake in terms of grams per day of carbohydrate, the greater the potential you have of increasing glycogen storage in your muscles. I mean, if we were to carry this out a little bit further, this would plateau because there's a limit to how much carbohydrate storage you actually can have. So higher carbohydrate intakes result in higher glycogen storage. There are some glycogen loading techniques. Glycogen loading is something that's practiced by athletes who are very worried about running out of carbohydrate. And the original method of glycogen loading was developed by Bergstrom, which required that you exercise with almost no carbohydrate intake at all. The idea was to deplete your muscles of carbohydrate as much as you possibly could. And then you would rest, that is, you would follow a regimen where you wouldn't use up any carbohydrate in your muscles at the same time that you had a very high carbohydrate diet. And that was supposed to somehow make your muscles behave like sponges so that your net increase in glycogen storage would be greater. But, it was found later by Sherman that all you had to do was taper your exercise down so you didn't use up the carbohydrate in your muscles and consume a diet high in carbohydrate. And these are statistically not different. So you end up basically in the same place, and you can avoid the depletion phase, which it has been found is potentially very dangerous for people if you deplete your glycogen stores. So all you got to do is don't use it up and have enough carbohydrates so that your bodies can store more, and that works really well. There was a study that was done by Kostel a while back. It's kind of an interesting study where he took people who weren't training, and he found that these people could exercise maybe 35 minutes without training. And then he trained them for 7 weeks. But with one group, he gave them a high carbohydrate diet, about 65% of total calories. and the other group he gave a relatively lower carbohydrate, higher protein diet. And you can see in both cases there was a training effect. So training helps your body adapt to do the work that you're doing better and more efficiently. So even on a lower carbohydrate diet, people were able to exercise quite a bit longer. I mean, from 35 minutes to 65 minutes, almost twice as long on a lower carbohydrate diet. But on a higher carbohydrate diet, people were able to exercise 102 minutes, so considerably longer uh, than um, than if you are on a lower carbohydrate intake. This has been pretty well established that the higher the intensity of activity, the greater the reliance on carbohydrate as a fuel. So if you look at this, if you're walking, maybe 40% of the fuel that your muscles use is coming from carbohydrate. If you jog, 50%. If you run, 80%. If you really go fast, almost all the fuel is that you're burning per unit of time is carbohydrate. So again, higher exercise intensities, greater reliance on carbohydrate as a fuel. And some people are worried, well, if you have all that carbohydrate, won't it elevate insulin? And won't the elevated insulin increase fat storage? Well, actually, working muscles are pretty good at tolerating carbohydrate. So if you look at what happens to blood insulin with people who are exercising, right? Um, and a little bit more fiber here, insulin is lower, right? A little bit more carbohydrate here, right? So just adding a little bit of good whole grains to the diet and exercise, you can cut the insulin response dramatically. So that's a good message. Mark Davis out of the University of South Carolina did a really interesting study where he developed what's called a shuttle run. He developed a run where people did 1 minute sprints. And he found that if during the course of this run that people were doing, this running for a minute, stopping, running for a minute, stopping, running for a minute to catch your breath and stopping, basically said over the course of a unit of time or until you get fatigued, how many of these 1 minute sprints can you complete before you actually have to stop? And he found that while people were doing it, if you gave them a non-caloric placebo, something that didn't have any calories at all, they could go 60 minutes and do 15 1-minute sprints until they reach fatigue. But if you gave them carbohydrate during the sprints, so something like a sports beverage and carbohydrate snacks, look at what happens. They can go longer, mainly because you're satisfying blood sugar and therefore brain requirements, but also you're providing a source of fuel to the muscles that supplements the glycogen which is already in the muscles. So it's a kind of an interesting study. And people worry about having sports beverages, and you have to be careful what kind of sports beverages you have. There's no delay in absorption when you drink water, but you're not also getting any electrolytes, which can help maintain blood volume, and you're not getting any energy that can help maintain blood sugar as well. So water, I guess, is okay, but not while you're exercising because you're not getting some of the things that you need. If you look at a 6% carbohydrate solution, there is no statistically significant difference between the rate of absorption of a 6% carbohydrate solution and just water. They're both absorbed at the same time. Actually, you get a slight gastric delay here, but once it gets into the intestines, it actually is absorbed a little bit faster than the water is. But look at how subtle a difference it takes to get a statistically significant difference. If you go up to an 8% carbohydrate solution, you get a dramatic reduction in the rate of absorption. So this stuff is going into the intestines and it's staying there. And now you may be pulling fluid from the blood into the intestines to dilute it before you absorb it. That's very counterproductive while you're exercising. And if you look at something like even 1% more, look at what happens. And fruit juice is about 12 to 14% carbohydrate. So full concentration fruit juice ends up being a pretty bad sports beverage. But, typical sports beverages are a 6 or 7% carbohydrate solution. They work really well, and they're very quickly absorbed. If you look at how athletes do on this, it's kind of interesting. I mean, some studies show that the consumption of carbohydrate is pretty lousy. I mean, this study, 1988 runners, somewhere between 3.9 grams per kg up to 8 grams per kg. I mean, what you'd really like to see is somewhere between 8 and 10 grams per kg on most athletes, and they seem to do really well when you do that. Again, I showed this to you before. If you just follow what happens to blood glucose during prolonged exercise, this is where the ATPs are coming from. If you look at free fatty acids, where the ATPs are coming from, muscle glycogen, triglyceride, you start to run out after a while, right? So you get less and less ATP from that. So you need fuel from other sources, mainly here, to make sure you can keep exercising. And, I think I showed you this as well, but it's important to repeat it here, that if you look at when you're going slowly, 25% of maximal oxygen consumption of VO2 max, the energy is coming from plasma glucose, that black line. It's coming from plasma free fatty acids, that's fat, and from muscle triglyceride, that's fat. So the vast majority of energy is coming from fat, but blood sugar, or carbohydrate, is contributing. And if you increase the intensity of activity, then the reliance on fat goes up a little bit, the reliance on blood sugar goes up a little bit, more than at 25% VO2 max, but that's still not enough, so you still have to add muscle glycogen to satisfy energy requirements. And then if you go even faster, then you have to add even more muscle glycogen to satisfy energy requirements. So, it's carbohydrate ends up being the thing that people can run out the quickest, particularly if they have bursts of speed, or if the activity that they're doing is all high intensity. There's a very high reliance on carbohydrate as a fuel. And then finally, I want you to see that getting fit makes a difference, because if you get fit, look at what happens. You can become much more reliant on fat, which we have no problem providing. We've got plenty of fat in our system, and less reliant on carbohydrate to satisfy your energy needs. So getting physiologically fit makes a huge difference in endurance, because you can rely on fuel that you got plenty of, and you become less reliant on carbohydrate, where we have limited stores. So that's the lecture for the day. Please ask your questions on our subsequent class on Tuesday, and I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.